Okay, hello everybody. I wanted to do a podcast series on something that's literally close to home for me since I live in the Bay Area, and that's the issue of homelessness and street drug use and drug addiction here in San Francisco. Now, the reason I wanted to do this is because, first of all, it's something that I see here almost every day. But also it's a talking point that conservatives like to use. And I want to sort of interrogate it and see, based on the numbers, if there's validity to the talking point. And the talking point is, California is a failed state. It's a liberal state, therefore a failed state. And San Francisco, being the most liberal part of California, is a failed city because of its terrible homelessness problem and all the street drug use and the street issues that have scared away businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to take a look at that and get into some numbers, a little bit of history. These numbers, by the way, are based on surveys that have been done locally by various academic institutions, and also by some numbers that the city has published itself. To take a look at, first of all, to see how bad is this problem in San Francisco, for example, compared to other major cities. Is it really worse here? I mean, there's an obvious problem here, but is it worse here than other places? And once we sort of get a handle on that, how we got here, what's really going on, then to look at the services that are available for people who are unhoused, who do have drug problems here in the city or mental health problems here in the city, and then to look at more that could be done that we're not currently really doing here to help with this problem. And obviously this is something that comes up in all the major elections here, the local elections like mayoral and city council elections, but also statewide elections like the governor's elections. These issues come up because this isn't just an issue for San Francisco. There's a lot of homeless in, for example, Los Angeles and pretty much any other major city you can name in California. So let's get right into it with some facts, some statistics, and see what kind of problem we're looking at here, and then what we're currently doing to address it, and then ways that we might address it better than it's currently being addressed. Okay, so first of all, there's three overlapping issues, and they sort of feed on each other. And then there's another major issue here that isn't really overlapping, but also feeds into this. So the first question is, how many homeless do we really have? And we're just talking about San Francisco now. San Francisco, by the way, is both a city and a county. So the county of San Francisco is also the city of San Francisco, and the population overall is roughly 800,000. We're going to say 800,000 just to make it easy. So on any given night, and there are a number of surveys that have been done on this, including people going up and down all the streets counting folks who are sleeping outside and in shelters. On any given night, there's about 8,000 people in San Francisco who are unhoused. That is, who don't have a fixed place to sleep at night. So figure 8,000 a night who are unhoused, and the city has 800,000 people. That means that 1 in every 100 people who are in San Francisco overnight are unhoused. And 1 in every 100 people, and that's 1%. So 1% of the San Francisco overnight population, we're not counting tourists here, but 1% of the San Francisco overnight population is unhoused. Now, you can ask, is that a lot? And the answer is yes, it is, but it's not the most. If we look around the country at other cities, for example, Los Angeles rate of homelessness is comparable pretty close to what San Francisco's is. New York's is higher, probably about twice what San Francisco's is. And so you can certainly find other cities that are comparable or higher as far as the unhoused population relative to San Francisco. But, San Francisco is definitely high. It's 1% of the population being unhoused in any given night is high. So, is this a problem? Sure. Sure it is. Now let's take a look at the major places where unhoused people stay if they want to try to get indoors. And keep in mind, a lot of unhoused people do not want to stay indoors because the indoor places for them are generally unsafe, unsanitary, and not very pleasant. But shelters, open shelters, which are just places where you can, register for a bunk bed, and they're usually big open rooms often affiliated with churches, church spaces, but also can be just, sort of general warehouse areas. On any given night in San Francisco, the number of beds available in just regular open shelters is about a little less than 4,000. Sort of in the 3,500, 3,800 bed range. So even if every bed were filled in the shelters in San Francisco, we still would have more than half of our unhoused population not having a place to sleep indoors. So is that a problem? Could be. Particularly because on any given night, about 90% of the shelter beds are taken. And the way it works in San Francisco, we'll get into this more when we talk about ways to improve the system, because I don't think this way is very good. But on any given day in San Francisco, because shelter beds are kind of at a premium given the number of people who are unhoused, people have to sort of line up and sign up for shelter beds. So there's like an afternoon routine wherever there's a shelter is you line up outside at a particular time of day, and then they take people one at a time and you sign up for a shelter bed for the evening. And often you can only sign up for one night, which means that if you want to stay multiple nights in a shelter, you have to keep re-signing, keep going through the process again and again, which is, obviously inefficient and a real pain for the people who are homeless and maybe trying to improve their situation. But anyway, so you line up, you try to sign up if there are beds available. And if you're too far back in line and there are no beds available at that shelter for the day, they may direct you to other shelters where they've heard that there's, beds available. And you may have to then travel to another shelter, usually by walking, because that's all you can do if you don't have any money. And then, try to sign up at another shelter. So this process in and of itself is a pain, and there aren't enough beds for everybody who might really want one. And the open shelters themselves, this is just big warehouse rooms with bunk beds, basically. The open shelters themselves, they don't have safe places to store your stuff, so people's stuff gets stolen. There's, for people who are, mentally ill and violent or more violently inclined, there's often fights and, violence. Women have gotten assaulted in open shelters. There isn't usually a lot of security at these places. They're also, loud and noisy and dirty. There's not enough bathrooms often, and it's kind of filthy. So given the environment in these shelters, it's not surprising that a lot of homeless people actually choose not to spend the night in the shelters, in part for fear for their safety and the safety of their stuff, and, just in part because it's just a terrible environment, hard to sleep, or do anything else. So even given that 90% of shelter beds on any given night, especially the colder nights, are taken up with people who've signed up to have a shelter bed for the evening. Some shelters, by the way, are they're restricted as to who can stay in the shelter. For example, there's shelters for teenagers. There's shelters just for women. Those are really important for the safety of women. Women are much safer statistically in the shelters for women than they are, just in a general open shelter. And shelters for teens, shelters for gay people. It's shelters for families. So there are certain, restricted shelters like that cater to certain populations, but there aren't many of those. Most shelters and most beds are open, just in big warehouses where anybody pretty much can sign up and spend the night. Of course, you don't have to pay for a shelter bed. So, if we're asking, is there a homeless issue in San Francisco? Yes. 1% of the population in any given night being unhoused is high. Not the highest, but high. So, you could ask the question, how did we get here? Why are there so many homeless in San Francisco? And a lot of it doesn't come down to what you think it comes down to. A lot of people would say, failed liberal policies or whatever, failed policing. But, policing isn't something that really solves homelessness. If somebody is, too mentally ill, for example, or too addicted, too deep in addiction to hold a job, and earn money to, get something that they have to pay for, then, that's not a problem that, policing can solve. That is, arresting people and jailing them. You may get them off the streets for a short period of time, but, it doesn't solve their problem of, they're too mentally ill or addicted to actually work. Here in the Bay Area, which is one of the most expensive places to live in the whole country, you have to earn a fair amount of money just to afford a cheap apartment. A cheap quote-unquote apartment that's not federally subsidized here in San Francisco will run you, $2,000 a month. And, that's just for the place to live, not for food or any transportation or anything else. And even if you manage to get what they call Section 8, which is federally subsidized housing, there's a lot of requirements. It's limited housing, very limited in San Francisco, and there are a lot of rules that apply. For example, you can't be a drug addict or associate with drug addicts or have a criminal record, et cetera, et cetera. So, federally subsidized housing is cheaper. It may be a few hundred a month, but it's still, that's still money that you have to earn or get through disability or whatever. By the way, a lot of folks who are homeless would certainly qualify for disability benefits, and some of them do get disability benefits. But some of them are too out of it to even apply. Because applying, if you've ever tried to do something like that, applying for disability benefits, for Section 8 housing, and all that, is a very arduous task. That requires a lot of mental focus, an ability to read and concentrate, fill out lots and lots of forms, and deal with bureaucrats. And so, a lot of people who are in these states just can't do that. But, so a lot of people who are homeless in the Bay Area are what they call economically homeless, which means their major problem isn't necessarily drug addiction or mental illness, as is often assumed, but is just they couldn't hold a job or they couldn't earn enough in the Bay Area to support, them to support their life here, to pay rent and buy food, etc. So let's look at a little bit of statistic here, based on surveys that they've done of folks who are homeless. In the Bay Area and in San Francisco in particular, about 1/3 of those folks have significant drug or alcohol addictions. Now, not all of those folks started with addictions. Sometimes it worked the other way, where they became homeless first, like economically homeless first, and then the life of being homeless was so depressing for them, they started self-medicating their depression with drugs and then became addicts. So it doesn't always work that you become an addict and then that makes you homeless, although sometimes that does happen. But it can also work the other way, where you become homeless economically for economic reasons, and then you get into drug addiction. But anyway, about 1/3 of people who are unhoused in San Francisco have a serious addiction, and about 1/3 suffer from a serious mental illness. And when I say serious mental illness, I mean more than just some anxiety or a little depression. I mean, they're psychotic in some way. They've broken from reality. Like they have psychosis, they have bipolar disorder, they have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is way more common in the homeless population than it is in the general population. For example, I think in the general population, about 1 in every 300 people is schizophrenic or psychotic. Whereas in the homeless population, I think it's about 1 in 10 to 1 in 15. So, much higher rate of these serious mental disorders in the unhoused population. A lot of unhoused people also have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which causes them to sometimes act out in extreme ways to sort of normal interactions. Some of them have severe clinical depression. And again, that can be a result of being homeless rather than a cause. Because, let's face it, being homeless and on the streets in San Francisco is depressing. So it can cause serious, being in that state, in that situation, can cause extreme depression. So not everybody, of course, who has extreme depression ends up homeless, but also not everyone who ends up homeless started with depression. Sometimes if they are very depressed, it may have come after the homelessness. Just like addiction sometimes comes after the homelessness rather than as a cause of it. Okay, so again, that's kind of what we're looking at based on surveys. By the way, there is overlap, of course. When we say 1/3 of unhoused have serious addictions, 1/3 have serious mental illness, there's some overlap in those. So, for example, there's a significant number of people who have both serious mental illness and drug addiction. A lot of times, for example, people with bipolar disorder medicate their disorder. They self-medicate with street drugs or alcohol. Alcohol can help with the manic part sometimes, and so can stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines. And street, when they're in the depressive phase, then they want to, again, try to self-medicate with cocaine or whatever, to try to, counteract those unpleasant feelings. Okay, but notice that the 1/3, even if there were zero overlap between these two groups, that would still leave 1/3 of homeless folks who don't have serious addictions or serious mental disorders. So it would leave 1/3 as just homeless because they're homeless, because they, generally those are economically homeless. They lost the job that they needed, or the support. Maybe they were getting family support or something and they lost that. And now they have no place to stay. So, this is what we're looking at when we look at the homeless population, but these things are self-reinforcing, because obviously if you have a serious mental illness or you have, a serious drug addiction or both, those things are going to make it difficult for you to find steady work, and therefore make it difficult for you to support yourself and get into regular shelter, like pay rent or, get into housing. For example, if you're an addict, you can't get into Section 8. the subsidized housing, which is kind of ridiculous, but because those are the folks who really need subsidized housing. And if you've committed a crime, if you have a felony conviction, for example, you also aren't eligible. And a lot of people who have these kinds of conditions end up with, felony convictions. They've been in jail, whatever. So, these are self-reinforcing issues. The mental illness, the drug addiction makes it harder for you to get out of the homeless situation and easier for you to get into it, to lose your job, to lose your base of support. So you're dealing with one issue. Like, you can't really just deal with homelessness without also dealing with the mental illness problem and the substance abuse problem. You need to deal with them all to have really an effective response to this. So a wide range of social service here is necessary if you really want to deal with it in a way that's not just, there have been towns like many, many years ago, Santa Barbara dealt with their homeless problem by ordering their police force to pick up all the homeless off the street and drive them to another city. And they did that. There was a time, this was, I think, 20 years ago, in Santa Barbara. The police force basically rounded up all the homeless folks. So anyone they saw was trying to sleep outside at night, they would put in a wagon, in a police wagon, and they would drive them down to like Ventura and Oxnard, or up to Lompoc or Solvang, and they would drop them off. And that was it. So they dealt with their homeless problem by deporting all the homeless to other cities. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem. It just makes the problem somebody else's problem. So one thing I'm not going to talk about is getting tough with policing as a solution by deporting homeless folks. I mean, could you do that? Sure. Does it solve the problem? No, it doesn't. It just makes your problem somebody else's problem. And by the way, eventually a lot of those homeless folks you've deported do make their way back to, wherever it was they started from. Okay, so how did we get here? This many homeless, this much of a problem. Well, part of the problem, actually, part of the issue started with Ronald Reagan, believe it or not. President Reagan back in the 1980s. And what President Reagan did, which I thought was really fascinating for a Republican president, it shows you how far we've come in the definition of Republican. But what President Reagan did when he was governor of California, this is before he was president, when he was governor of California, is he essentially opened up the institutions that were housing most of the seriously mentally ill folks and the extreme addicts. Those folks used to be put into mental institutions and housed there indefinitely against their will. But in the 1980s, laws changed. You could no longer house mentally ill people against their will. You had to go through a lengthy court hearing to get them declared incompetent, to have a conservator named who would speak on their behalf, etc. So laws changed, and in response to that, Governor Reagan at the time just said, okay, fine, I'm just going to open up all the mental institutions, we're going to let everybody out. And that's what he did. So suddenly the California streets were basically flooded with folks who had, before that, been institutionalized. We're talking many, many, many thousands of people who hit the streets all at once. People who are suffering from these severe mental illness, sometimes from severe drug addiction, although usually it was severe mental illness for these folks. And they were all released at once. They all hit the streets at the same time. And we're still dealing sort of with the ramifications and the aftermath of that these people were released without treatment, without supervision, just there you go, we open the door and you're on the street now. Most of them did not have the ability to take care of themselves. A lot of them didn't have family who were willing to take care of them. And, so that began this issue. More recently, conservatives have liked to point to areas like in downtown San Francisco that have basically been depopulated. Downtown San Francisco used to be a hot place for new businesses, like tech businesses, to open up. And, there was a very vibrant downtown life as far as, clubs opening, exercise clubs, nightclubs, high-end restaurants for catering to the tech folks and the business folks who work in places like Schwab Investments downtown. So, there used to be a lot of people downtown with a lot of money and a lot of wealthy businesses located there in downtown San Francisco. But what actually, when conservatives look around at the depopulation of the businesses in the area and the failing of the businesses that catered to these folks, like the restaurants, they say, see, homelessness is chasing everyone away. But it actually didn't go like that. What depopulated San Francisco was COVID. When the COVID epidemic hit, because up until that time we had plenty of homeless, but there was still lots of businesses and a bustling downtown nightlife. But when COVID hit, the businesses all shut down. They had their people work remotely from home. So no one was coming into the city, no one with money anyway. And so it was COVID that depopulated the streets. Plus, people weren't working out in gyms. The gyms closed down. The restaurants mostly went to take out. And that's what depopulated the downtown area. No one wanted to come to San Francisco to take out something from a restaurant and then bring it home. That wasn't what the scene was about. And, the music venue shut down. The entertainment venue shut down. So it was actually COVID, not homelessness, that depopulated downtown San Francisco. But then once these richer folks, who had good jobs and money to spend, once they disappeared from downtown during COVID, then there was sort of a vacuum. The streets were emptied out. And that's when the homeless folks who were there, who had mostly confined themselves to, small areas around, say, the Civic Center, they started spreading out. Because there's no one on the street, no one to complain about them, no one to call the cops. And so at that point, they started spreading out to fill the vacuum. And so now, by the, 3-4 years into COVID, if you went to, say, Powell Street Center or whatever, you would see a lot of homeless folks there that you didn't used to see there, and a lot of closed businesses. But again, that was all due to COVID. It was not due to the homeless population. They just took over the area when the area depopulated. So, with a lot of these things that, conservatives like to point out on the streets of San Francisco, yeah, they're real, but they weren't the result of what these people are saying. They weren't the result of homelessness. They were the result of an epidemic that shut everything down. So what I want to talk about next is the resources that are currently available to unhoused people and to people who are suffering from serious drug addiction and serious mental illness. Because again, as I said, those things feed on each other. The mental illness and the addiction feeds on the homeless population, and in some cases creates part of the homeless population. So, I want to talk about services available for all of these things, and that will be the topic of our next video, the second podcast in the series. We'll have that as the major topic. What services are available right now for these folks? We've already talked a little bit about it by talking about shelter beds, but we're going to talk about more than that in the next video. And then in the final video, final podcast for this series, we're going to talk about what services we should have. Not the ones we have, but the ones we should have or should expand, that might really make a dent in this problem, because I'm admitting here that yes, this is a problem. 1% of your overnight population being unhoused is a problem. And people openly using drugs on the street, etc., also a problem. And people with serious mental illness just wandering the streets at night, also a problem. So I'm admitting the problem here, that there is one. We should be dealing with it, because we're a caring society, and caring societies, deal with folks who have serious problems that are interfering with their lives and also the lives of other people in the society. So, second video coming up is, the services we have today for this, and then third video is, what services should we have that might more effectively deal with this issue. Okay, so thanks for watching so far.